One of the things that I think is really fascinating about Jesus' teaching, in particular his parables, is that they have particular contexts. They are not just stories that come out of nowhere and are offered to us in a book. They're stories that are often told in response to something that's happening in the immediate circumstance around Jesus. Now, what's difficult is that in the Gospels, we don't always have that immediate context. And sometimes different gospel writers will transplant these stories into different contexts, or like Matthew will collect them together and group them together thematically. Well, that can be helpful for us as readers because it allows us to compare and contrast different stories and get a better angle on what Jesus might be saying, rooting them in their contextual moments where Jesus is speaking to a person or addressing a specific situation can actually give us wildly different ideas and ways of coming at these stories. What was it that Jesus was saying? Not in a general, wide sense to all of us, but what was he saying to a particular person when he first told this story? That changes things a lot, and I think it really invites us into the work of what a parable is all about. To wrestle with the story, to wonder about the story, and to get kind of creative in how we interpret that story.
You might recognize this story as I read it. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. But a man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was quite wealthy. He wanted to see Jesus, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. And just a little detour here. For fun, you may have heard this story, you may have even sung this song as a child, and you may have assumed all your life that Luke is telling you that Zacchaeus was a tiny little man. The text here, though, is incredibly ambiguous. It could be that Zacchaeus wanted to see who Jesus was, but because Zacchaeus was short, he could not see over the crowd. It could also be that Zacchaeus wanted to see who Jesus was, but because Jesus was short, he could not see over the crowd. We actually don't know which one Luke intended. And in fact, we have writings from church fathers that actually assumed it was the latter. We stan a short king. Jesus was too short to be seen over the crowd. Either way, let's keep reading here. Verse 4. So Zacchaeus ran ahead and climbed a tree to see him since Jesus was coming that way. And when Jesus reached that spot, he looked up and he said, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So come down, and he welcomed him gladly. Now all the people saw this, and they began to mutter and grumble to themselves, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up in front of everyone and said, look, Lord, here and now, I give half my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anyone here out of anything, I will pay that back 4 times over. And Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. And the Son of Man has come to save and seek the lost like him. And so while they were listening to this, he went on to tell them a parable. Because he was near Jerusalem and the people thought the kingdom of God was going to appear any time. Now, notice this. This parable is about the timing of God's kingdom. Makes a lot of sense why Matthew places it where he does, right? In a collection of parables about the end of the age, right? But listen to the start of the same parable in Luke. He said, a man of noble birth went to a distant country to have himself appointed king and then return. And he called 10 of his servants and he gave them 10 minas. Put this money to work, he said, until I come back. Minas are another measure of currency, technically, like talenton, a measure of weight. A very large amount, this time a much more reasonable amount. 1 talent equals about 60 minas. But listen to this. His subjects hated him. And they sent a delegation after him. We do not want this man to be our king. Still, he was made king and returned home, and he sent for the servants he had given his money in order to find out what they had gained with it. And from there, the story unfolds basically the same way it did in Matthew. The servants bring back their money. Those who double it are praised. But the one who brings back only what the master gave him is punished and cast out. But notice here, where Matthew perhaps hints at the idea that maybe the master in this story does not represent God. He's a hard man who reaps what he has not sown. I'm going to argue There's very little confusion here in Luke, right? This man is hated by his subjects. He's an illegitimate king who's appointed over them. There's nothing in this story that makes me think this character is a stand-in for God. And in fact, looking at the context of Jesus' conversation with Zacchaeus, I would argue this character is a stand-in for the Roman Empire. I mean, think about it. Zacchaeus is a Jewish man that works for Rome. He's a tax collector. That means his job is to extract the taxes from his people that are owed to a king the people despise. And often how this worked in Rome is that Rome would make a tax assessment of an area, and then they would sell that contract to a collector. Zacchaeus, in this story, is an architalones. That means that he would bid on these contracts with Rome. And then he would oversee a staff of collectors whose job was to extract whatever resources they could, from which Zacchaeus would remit Rome's assessed value back to the capital. The scam being that whatever excess value he could extract from the people, that was his pay. That could be used to bribe the next contract with Rome or pocketed by his collectors under the supervision of someone like Zacchaeus. That's why Zacchaeus says, look, if I've cheated anyone, I will return it 4 times over. The people resent him, not just because they don't like paying taxes, although that's probably a big part of it. They saw Rome as an occupying force, a king imposed on them, just like in Jesus' story. But the real reason they resent Zacchaeus in particular was because, by his own admission, he's been skimming off the top, overcharging his own people who were already suffering under the oppressive taxation of Rome. That's who Jesus goes to dinner with. That's why the crowd is so enraged by the invitation. That's why the crowd is, understandably, pretty skeptical when Zacchaeus, in front of Jesus, promises to change his ways. And so Jesus, being Jesus, decides to tell a story. Friends, don't discount what Zacchaeus is promising. Zacchaeus, don't underestimate the consequence of what you're saying. It will be like this. You will go back to your foreign king with only what is owed to him, and it will not go well for you. The expectation in an unjust system is not justice, it is the status quo. And Zacchaeus, if your commitment is really to change that, well, then you better understand the consequence of that choice. Is that really the path you want to go down? See, essentially, as I read it, this parable is Jesus saying, Zacchaeus, I love what I'm hearing, but I see why your neighbors are skeptical. Do you really know what you're promising right now? Because it's not just restitution for what you stole, it's exclusion from the system that has afforded you all the privilege and the wealth that you've enjoyed for so long. See, this isn't a parable about the kingdom. Jesus never says it is. This isn't a parable about God's judgment. Jesus never implies that. This is a parable about the judgment, the cost of doing what's right. And the hard truth is, sometimes that means there will be weeping and gnashing in teeth in your life, and it's not because you failed. It's because you held fast to the way of peace. And you need to know this. Pain, suffering, consequence, even rejection, that's not necessarily because you failed God. Any gospel that tries to convince you the way of Jesus will always be easy is sadly a lie, because here's the truth. Healthy, honest relationships are hard. Maintaining a good and a just relationship to wealth, particularly when you are wealthy, is hard. Living at peace in a world that wants to shape your imagination with violence is hard. Turning toward your neighbors when we are constantly told it's us and them is hard. Trusting that you won't get it right, but all you can do is count on Jesus to wake you up when the time comes. That's hard. But that's the point. Because the way is narrow and few of us find it, and when we do, it leads us back to new life.